I was born on December 14th, 1930. I'll have my 93rd birthday in a few weeks. And I grew up on the southwest side of Montgomery at 135 Hercules Street, shotgun house. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My father died when I was 2. My mother only had about a 5th or 6th grade education, but she taught the 5 of us that we could be anything we wanted to be if we did 3 things. 1, kept Christ first in our lives. 2, to stay in school and get a good education. And 3, stay out of trouble. I tried to do all 3. My first 12 years was spent in Montgomery, attending what was then lovely school on West Jeff Davis Avenue, which recently was changed to Fred David Gray Avenue on the west side of Montgomery. I was my family was a very religious family. We grew up at the Holt Street Church of Christ, which is still on the corner of Holt and Columbia. As a matter of fact, it's in the same block that Holt Street Baptist Church is located on, where the first Montgomery bus boycott took place. Holt Street Baptist Church is in the north end of that block, and Holt Street Church of Christ is on the south end, on the same side of the street. Because I was quite religious, we had a preacher who was from Tennessee and knew about a Church of Christ school in Nashville for African American young men to learn to be a preacher. In that sense, I was kind of baptizing cats and dogs. Our preacher arranged for me somehow to get up there in school, and so I went to high school in Nashville, which is also a Church of Christ related school, where Lisbon University is also a Church of Christ related school. But at the time I finished out at the Nashville Christian Institute, and that was in 1948, because nothing was desegregated in the South, so I couldn't attend school there. Came back home to Montgomery to learn a little something about preaching, to learn how to be a teacher, which was the 2 things that black boys in those days could do. So I used the bus transportation system, and it was during the time I used this transportation system that I learned that African American people in Montgomery were having serious problems on the buses. It was completely segregated. One man had had an altercation on the bus and was killed as a result of it. And it was while I was there that I decided I would become not only a preacher, but they told me that, and a teacher, but they said that lawyers help people solve problems. And I thought African Americans in Montgomery at that time had problems. So as a result of seeing what was taking place on the buses, I decided I was going to become a lawyer. Not just a lawyer in a place, but a lawyer in Montgomery. I was encouraged by Mr. E.D. Nixon, who was really Mr. Civil Rights in Montgomery at that time, had been the president of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, and also he had been president of the state conference of branches of the NAACP. He encouraged me to become a lawyer. He was always looking for lawyers, because when a black person in Montgomery had a race problem, they would usually go to Mr. Nixon. His wife was also a member of the same church that I attended, the Holt Street Church of Christ. And Ms. Professor Pierce, who was the political science instructor at Alabama State, encouraged me to become a lawyer and thought that we needed more lawyers. It was during that time that I met Mrs. Rosa Parks. She was the secretary to the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. She was also the youth director. And the person she was dealing with at the time I entered Alabama State when I was 17. And the youth she was dealing with wasn't too far behind me. So I met her during that period of time, and that relationship continued. Finished Alabama State in May of 1948. Now, I enrolled in December of 47, graduated in May of 51. And I decided then that I was going to become a lawyer. I not even applied to the University of Alabama because I knew they wouldn't admit me. Finished Alabama State. I was going to come take the Ohio bar exam just in case, take the Alabama bar exam, become a lawyer, and destroy everything segregated I could find. Those was what my commitments were while I was a student at Alabama State. But the state of Alabama had a program, as most of the southern states did, where they would pay a portion of our tuition, room, and board not to go to Auburn or university or the white university if we went to an accredited school out of the state. And I elected Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. I had to go someplace where I could get a part-time job. And at that time, Cleveland had I don't know whether they still have it now, but they had a motto that it was the best location in the nation. If you wanted to work, whether it was part-time or full-time, you could in Cleveland. I also found out, which was very important to me, because I needed to get a job to help to pay my tuition. But all of the classes was between 8:30, or 8, I used 8 or 8:30 until 12:30. So all of the classes were in the morning. That would give me an opportunity where I could probably get a job for 3 or 4 hours and still have time to do my homework for the next day's work. I spent my 3 years in Cleveland. I became connected with the East 100th Street Church of Christ in Cleveland. As a matter of fact, after a year, I served as the assistant minister of that church, and then was able to finish in 3 years. And that was in June of 54. Stopped by Columbus and took the Ohio bar just in case. And a month later, I took the Alabama bar. So I had taken, at the end of July of 54, had taken 2 bar exams and hadn't heard from either until August. I was informed by the Ohio examiners that I'd passed the bar and I need to come back to Cleveland to be admitted. And a little later, I got a letter from the Alabama State Bar telling me I had been admitted. But Alabama, you didn't have to go. All they did was sent to you an oath of office. You signed the oath, sent it back. They send you your license to practice. And that occurred on the 7th of September, 1954. Now I'm ready to begin destroying everything segregated I could find. You couldn't advertise like you can now, so you had to go to churches and become members of organizations, and you could have an open house. So I had an open house, and Rosa Parks was one of the hostesses at my open house because I already met her when I was in college, and she had encouraged me to go to law school. And I had met also Clifford Durr, who was a white lawyer in Cleveland, in Montgomery. And he had a nephew who was also practicing law. They were practicing law together. I borrowed some of their books, so it looked like a lawyer's office when we had the open house. And after the open house, and I was, that first office was 113 Monroe Street, Mrs. Sparks worked for the Montgomery Fair, and she would usually come from her office, where she worked, to my office at 113 Monroe Street, and we would have lunch each day. So from the time I opened my office until December 1st, 1955, the day of her arrest, we met, we talked about the problems, we talked about youth, we talked about the problems we were having on buses, we talked about the fact that all the schools were still desegregated, we talked about the problems that people had on the buses. And she used the buses also to travel to and from. And while she never told me, I had a feeling that as a result of our conversations, if the opportunity presented itself, she probably would not get up, and I thought she would be a very good person, because I really believed that ultimately we was going to have to file a lawsuit. So we met, had our last meeting on December 1st, 1955. I had an appointment out of the city. She went back to work. When I got back, I had phone calls telling me that she had been arrested. I returned her call, and she told me what had taken place, and she told me that this was on a Thursday evening, and her trial was the following Monday at 8:30 in the Recorder's Court of the City of Montgomery. And she wanted me to represent her. I told her I would. But I also reminded her that Ms. Joanne Robinson, who was a professor of English at Alabama State, and who had had a problem on a bus some years earlier, had a very interesting bad experience, and she had always felt that the community needed to be involved. And I told Ms. Sparks, I said, I believe Ms. Robinson, and incidentally, I had a call from Ms. Robinson when I got back too, because I had talked with her earlier. And I told her, and Mr. Nixon had signed the bond so she could get out of jail. And I told Ms. Sparks, I said, well, let me do this. Let me go and talk to Mr. Nixon. And I'm going to talk to Ms. Joanne Robinson and see what she thinks about if this may be an opportune time for the community to get involved. I left Ms. Sparks' house, went to E.G. Nixon's house, talked with him. He was a Pullman car porter, and he's usually home 3 days, and then he's on the road 3 days going on the train up to Chicago. So I told him that Ms. Sparks had retained me to represent her. But I said also, Ms. Robinson, who was then chairman of the Women's Political Council, which was a black organization of educated women who were doing everything to improve conditions of African Americans in that day. I said, I'm going to go and talk with her and see what she said. He said, well, what you do, you talk to Ms. Robinson and get back in touch with me, because I'm going to have to leave on the train after tomorrow. And we need to if we're going to do anything, I need to contact these preachers and see, won't they get involved? Went to Ms. Robinson's house, and Mrs. Robinson and I sat down, and it's all set out in Bus Ride to Justice. We discussed in detail what needed to happen. She said that what we need to do is try to have the people to stay off the buses. I said, well, you know, John, just staying off the bus is not going to change things. It's going to take a lawsuit. But it's going to take a long time for a lawsuit to go. So she said, well, if we ask them to stay off for one day, then we'll make plans for the next day. I said, well, if it's successful the one day, what about the next day? So we sat, and in her living room, we planned the activities for the Montgomery bus boycott. We said, one, she says, well, we can't tell them that it's going to go stay off the buses until you finish a lawsuit. But she said, well, let's see if we can't get them to stay off of a bus for one day. Well, we knew that any plans we made would be of no effect. We had to give that information back to Mr. Nixon. Mr. Nixon would have to do. But the bottom line is we decided, one, that we were going to try to get the community to stay off the buses for one day. If that was going to happen, we were going to need a spokesman. Ms. Robinson suggested her pastor, Martin Luther King, who had just been in town. Matter of fact, he was became officially the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church the Sunday before my license was issued to practice law. And I just said we need to get the two black leaders involved. E.D. Nixon, we've talked about, and Rufus Lewis was another man who had been a coach at Alabama State, but also had a nightclub named the Citizens Club. And in order to get in that club, you had to be a registered voter. And then she says that, well, we're going to also need to get those two persons involved, you're going to need a lawyer. He or my send me. As a result of our plans, we recommended to the community that Dr. King becomes the spokesman for the group. E.D. Nixon become treasurer because they need to raise the money, and the Pullman carpooler, he knew A. Philip Randolph in New York who would help to do that. Rufus Lewis would be chairman of the Transportation Committee because his wife was co-owner of Ross Clayton Funeral Home, and they had automobiles and they could help to get people transported. And Fred Gray would serve as legal counsel.
So you were how old at the time?
24. And when the chips were down, those were the recommendations that we made to Mr. Nixon, that he made to the community. And the first official meeting, was that next Friday. See, this all happened Thursday night, Friday evening at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And the trial took place, Ms. Park's case took place, we had it. She was convicted. The first official meeting was at Mount Zion Church, when the activities that we had recommended was ratified. The bus boycott mass meeting was at Hope Street Baptist Church. Dr. King made a speech, and Joanne and I sat and looked and listened, and the rest of it is history. We were only concerned about trying to solve the immediate problem we had at that time. Because as time developed and things developed, we understood the importance of what we did. Rosa Parks' case was not the first civil rights case I had. Claudette Cobbin, the 15-year-old girl who did what Rosa Parks did, but did it 9 months before. Without the knowledge, not the training, not the experience, but she had just finished having Black History Month, and felt that it was very important that Black people had rights. And the day after, on March the 2nd, and Claudette lived up on a part of Montgomery that's called King Hill, with the northeast part. And it was only about 3 streets that Black people lived in, and were surrounded by whites. And they had to take the bus to go. They would take a bus from there downtown, get another bus, and go out to Booker Washington School, which was on Union Street near High. And on March the 2nd, the teachers were having a meeting. So the students were let out early. And this group of kids who lived on King Hill decided, and it wasn't too far from High Street and Union, where the school was located, to downtown. So they thought they'd just walk down to the Capitol, catch Capitol Heights bus to go home. But they got an earlier bus than the usual bus they get because school was out. And as a result of that, it ended up, when they got downtown near the square, a lot of white people got on, more than was on when the kids would get on later on a later bus. And it developed that Claudette was sitting not on the first 10 seats that had been reserved, but was sitting in a seat just in front of the back door. And when the white people came on, they asked these black kids, and there was one black adult, to get up and give us our seats. Claudette, the others got up, Claudette didn't. She said, well, we're not sitting in the reserved seats for white people, and I have a constitutional right to be here. She didn't get up. To make a long story short, she was arrested, taken to jail, called her parents. The parents called the preacher called E.D. Nixon, got her out. He recommended that we represent Claudette. We represented Claudette in March, a little later on in March of that same year, in the juvenile court of Montgomery County. They claimed her that she was a delinquent. I told the judge, Judge Hill, that she wasn't a delinquent, she was an honest student. But what they were trying to do was to enforce the segregation laws, which were unconstitutional. He listened to me, denied my motions, found her to be a delinquent, and ordered her to be in custody of her parents, so she didn't have to make any reports. And she was ready to file a lawsuit, but the community weren't quite ready. Joanne Ripington arranged a meeting with the city officials and bus company officials. They said they were sorry about what happened and it wouldn't happen again, but it did happen with Rosa Parks' case, and the rest of that's history.
Were you concerned about Claudette's age as well, if you were going to bring a big case with her about?
Well, I thought the fact that she gave the adults the motivation to do something. If a 15-year-old girl can do this, what can adults do? She was the motivating fact, and I think it helped Mrs. Parks to do what she did, and it gave sentiment for the 40,000 African Americans to stay off of the buses for, 383 days. From Claudette Colvin to Rosa Parks, on Rosa Parks' case. When we filed the case of Browder versus Gale, which really integrated the buses, I ended up being sure that if Claudette Colvin and her parents wanted to be plaintiffs in that case, and I thought they did, and they were plaintiffs in it. From that case to the case in March, when they ended up indicting the 89 people, including Dr. King, tried his case in March. He was convicted. He was not known before that trial, but after that trial, he was known. And so we've written a book with Dan and David Fisher in terms of King, Alabama versus King. Once that case was over, he became an international figure. Then the NAACP filed a lawsuit because they thought that the Montgomery boycott was the result of the NAACP, so we ended up representing them in that case. And you later filed that a couple of years later, well, we had the bus boycott, then we had the in 1950, this was 54, 56, 57, state legislature passed a law gerrymandering blacks out of the city of Tuskegee. We handled that case. So all of those cases ended, but we still had no cases up until this point. Everything was still desegregated in Alabama. Once I got involved and people saw that they had a lawyer who would handle these cases, I didn't have to worry about, I didn't make the plans for them. The other people made the plans. The Lucy case, as far as education, the Arthur and Lucy case was the first case to desegregate the buses, the university. But then they accused the lawyers and Miss Lucy Arthurine of making bad statements about the officials of the university, so they expelled us. So you still didn't have any schools that were there. You had about 10 years, almost 9 years, since Brown versus Board of Education. So the NAACP and other groups decided they needed to do something in Alabama. And they decided that they would see, I was approached to see if I would be willing, if the NAACP found people who wanted to go, if I would represent them. And I told them I would. The Franklin case was different than the case involving Malone and Hood, because the NAACP had contacted me on that. But Harold Franklin himself came to my office in Montgomery. And he came there not for the purpose of going to Auburn. He was a graduate of Alabama State, I think with a major in history. But he was thinking about going to law school. So he came by to see me about signing an affidavit so that he could register as a law student. He was going to go to somebody's law school. And I told him, I said, well, you know, Harold, that the NAACP is trying to get people to desegregate these other schools. Auburn is here. Why don't you consider going to graduate school? He says, well, he'll consider it. Came back, he decided he'll do it, and he applied. And when he applied, they denied his admission. And they denied his admission because he applied to the graduate school. But they denied his admission, saying that he was a graduate of an undergraduate school that was not accredited. Alabama State was not accredited. And so they said, but we filed the lawsuit and ultimately got him admitted. Now, I thought he had graduated from an accredited school. He had graduated from Alabama State. Auburn is a state institution also. If Alabama State, and they didn't say anything, he didn't know anything, he didn't know what they were going to say, so he applied. And we got over that hurdle about the non-accreditation. But we had another problem. They went and put him in a dormitory that was able to accommodate several hundred students, and he was only one student in a wing of students. So we had to get that problem solved. And finally, things got adjusted. Well, I mean, he was an average type person. I had no problem with any of the plaintiffs involved. Well, number one, I was very careful in people that I ultimately, while they would bring people to me, if I'm going to represent them, I have to feel comfortable with that person. And all of these people I represented, those that ultimately were there, did not necessarily mean they were the only persons that they brought, but they were the ones that I thought would serve as a plaintiff and be able to withstand the pressure that would probably be brought against him. He knew what had happened in Alabama, so I didn't need to tell him about that. And he was willing to take the risk, and he did. I didn't consider any real pressure. I would go to court prepared, so the court would have no reason to scold me for not being prepared. I would try to have my clients prepared, and I try to be sure that I was on the right side of the law. And I would simply represent my client just like the other lawyer on the other side is representing his client. And that's the way it goes. Well, I didn't get personally involved in these cases. Not my case, it's the client's case. It was my job to do the best job I could do in court for each one of them. And that's what I did in every one of these cases. When a person comes to your office and wants you to do something, they don't care too much about what the past has been, whether their case is a good case or a bad case. They think it's a good case. And then the lawyer has to be the one to make the decision as to whether it's good or whether it's bad. That was my job. And if I let myself get too personally involved in it, then I'll have some real serious problems. But as you may or may not know, Auburn had some other problems other than Franklin. And Auburn probably is the only school, only university that we had to go back into court on some other issues. Some 20 years later, Auburn University was designated, as you know, as Alabama Extension Service. And they had discrimination in that aspect of the university. And we filed a lawsuit on behalf of Willie L. Strain versus Harry Philpott, president of Auburn, because they were discriminating in connection with that program. My law partner then, who was Solomon Say, ended up basically handling that case for him. And what he ended up doing, and it took us several years of taking care of the Strain case. Then there was another case against Auburn that we also had. Dr. Smith, who was the affirmative action director, who was black, had problems too, that they were discriminating against him. So we had to file a case for him also. But time has passed and conditions have changed, and hopefully things are now much better than they were then. When I started out deciding to become a lawyer, the only thing I was concerned then with was to see that African Americans receive all of the rights and privileges as any other citizen of the United States. That's all. Never thought about any awards, never thought about any honorary degrees. I just wanted us to receive equal treatment. I was naive enough to believe that the white power structure in my home state of Alabama, if they would see that African Americans could perform as well as they, and sometimes better, that they would have a change of heart. 69 years later, I'm sorely disappointed that many persons have not changed their attitudes and are only willing to just do what the courts say do. But they ought to do it because it's the right thing to do. Because when I accepted these cases, all of them, there are a couple of things I had to satisfy myself on. Number one, I have to be sure that I think that the person has a good cause of action. And secondly, because of my religious background, is this the type thing that the Lord would be pleased with me if I obtained this for him? So there's the religious aspect of it. And then there's a third thing that comes to me, that is, I don't have to accept any case to come in. Is this the kind of case that Fred Gray feels is what he would like to do and like to accomplish if he's successful? And he has to also consider the likelihood of success. And if you lose, what? There you are. So all of those things came into play as I considered each of these cases. And that's why, and I think most importantly, some years later, after we had filed these cases to desegregate schools, we did 5 of those at one time, including the one here in Macon County. But in this case, when when Governor Wallace decided to close the doors of the school, I concluded that if he could close one door, we could file an action against him and have all the school systems in Alabama desegregated. And we were able to do that. It took us 5 years to do it, but it took place. And while in many of those cases that Judge Johnson presided over, he designated the federal government as a party. So I had the federal government involved. Then in 1972, I found out that the federal government was engaged in a deadly study of untreated syphilis in Macon County, Alabama, where I've been doing a lot of these cases, but didn't know anything about it. And on July the 27th, 1972, Charlie Pollard came into my office and said he was one of those men. And we sit here in a museum now where those men said, and Herman Shaw, who was another participant in the study, said to the president when President Clinton invited him to the White House, he said, "We thank you for inviting us here, but we have just established the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, and that is for the purpose of showing the contribution that we men made in the field of healthcare, even though we didn't know it." So we sit here now under this chandelier and on this exhibit, which shows the 623 names of those men. Charlie W. Pollard, the man who came into my office in September of 72. And that case, believe it or not, is still pending. But what Mr. Shaw said to the president, we need your help so that people can come and see. And we have the descendants of these people come here every year, and they find the name of their grandfather or great-grandfather or whoever they are. But this facility doesn't have any permanent financial support, and we need it. And for those persons who think that what I've been able to do with all of these cases over these years, I accept those awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom Award, on behalf of those people. And if you really want to help them, then make a substantial contribution to the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, which is where we're here. But this center serves not only for the purpose of serving as a memorial to those people, but it teaches and it educates the people on the contribution made by the 3 ethnic groups that has developed this whole country. Native Americans, we used to call them Indians. It was their land. European Americans came and took theirs away and put them on reservations. the European Americans brought the African Americans as slaves. So you see, those three groups are the ones who've made this country. You can go on the other side of that wall over there, and if you go through it, above it, it'll tell you what period of time. Down below, you'll see a globe, and above the globe, it tells you what was happening in Macon County. Below the globe, it will tell you what's happening in the rest of the world. Then and it includes slavery, Reconstruction, the land, and if you go over here, the establishment of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University. It even brings you up to the Tuskegee Airmen, who were able to show that African Americans, it's all here. Then you get to this center part that I've already talked with you about. Then if you go to the other western part of it, you will see cases 5. You'll see basically all of the constitutional amendments to the Constitution. You'll see basically all of the lawsuits and all of the federal statutes that have been passed, which have enabled African Americans to come from slavery to the present time. So it is a unique museum, unlike any other museum, and we have had some of the persons, particularly Dr. Wilson over at Auburn University, who has worked with us in connection with it. And we invite all of the persons who are interested in civil and human rights, because it was people who were filing lawsuits in Macon County, Alabama, to get the right to vote as early as the early 40s, long before I was a practicing lawyer. But Mr. Arthur Shores, a black lawyer up in Birmingham, filed those suits. And we need to keep the doors open. We invite you to visit it and to support it. Well, all the things that I hear from Auburn now, and it's just, I know nothing more than what I see in the media. I think Auburn is headed in the right direction, and I would like to believe that we had and played a good part in giving them a good start, and hope they will continue. But I think what we all need to realize is that the struggle for equal justice under the law continues. I still believe that we have 2 basic problems confronting this nation. One is racism, believe it or not, and 2 is inequality. We need to seriously look at ourselves, look at our churches, look at our institutions of higher learning, look at the communities in which we live. And if everybody there look like me, you may have a serious problem of whether or not we really have equality. Look at the various economic indexes, and you'll still find that minorities usually have, they're usually the last high and the first 5. We still have inequalities, there's inequality in us, and we still have racism, and we need to do everything we can to destroy it. And that's what Jesus taught his disciples. He says, whatsoever you would that men do unto you, do it to yourself. So you know, if you don't want to be treated a certain way, then don't treat anybody else that way. The struggle for equal justice continues.